Have you ever paused to consider what truly brings happiness in the later stages of life? Is it the unwavering support of family and friends, or is there something more profound, something intrinsically personal that contributes to our sense of fulfillment? Imagine if the secret to a rewarding and joyful retirement doesn't solely depend on finding someone to lean on, but rather on rekindling your inner strength and embracing independence. In today's video, we'll delve into the poignant story of Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, a vibrant woman in her early 60s, who found herself standing at a pivotal juncture between the solace of her established routine and a yearning for something more meaningful. By staying with us until the end of this video, you'll gain deep insights into how Eleanor's journey underscores the significance of self-love, the beauty of solitude, and the joy that can be found in life's simplest moments. Despite grappling with feelings of loneliness and the inevitable changes that come with aging, Eleanor ultimately discovers that genuine happiness emanates from within, even as she navigates the twilight years of her life. We'll explore compelling lessons on cultivating your sense of peace and why leaning on yourself might be the most fulfilling path as you grow older. Don't miss out on the heartwarming and inspiring lessons from Eleanor's story that will encourage you to rethink what it truly means to live a happy, independent life after the age of 60. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, I highly recommend hitting that subscribe button and activating the notification bell so you never miss out on any of our upcoming videos. Your support means the world to us, and if you found value in this video, please help us continue spreading these meaningful lessons by liking and sharing them with others. Enjoying the topic of this video? Please leave a comment with 1 below. If it's not quite what you were looking for, feel free to comment 0, so we can understand how to improve and create better content tailored just for you. Now, let's embark on Eleanor Thompson's inspiring journey. Every afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson made a ritual of brewing herself a soothing cup of tea before stepping onto her small front porch. From there, she could observe the lively scene unfolding on the bustling main road just outside her suburban home. Cars whizzed by, and pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, their faces reflecting the rhythm of modern life. Eleanor enjoyed watching young families strolling by, the cheerful laughter of children chasing each other on the grassy lawns, and the occasional couple walking hand in hand. These fleeting moments warmed her heart, yet left a bittersweet ache, reminding her of the companionship she once had. Anyone who has experienced living alone in their golden years would likely empathize with Eleanor's longing. She wasn't lacking in material comforts. Decades ago, she and her late husband, Robert, had built their modest but charming home together, filling it with the laughter of their 2 children and the echoes of shared dreams. After Robert passed away 10 years ago, Eleanor chose to stay in the home they had built, keeping herself busy with a small bookkeeping business she managed from her living room. It provided her with enough income to enjoy a comfortable retirement and set aside a respectable savings account for her old age. Many people considered her fortunate. She had a house, financial stability, and grown children who had carved out successful lives for themselves. Yet, Eleanor's heart ached for something money couldn't buy, someone to share her life with. She longed for a companion, a peer who could sit with her over morning coffee and reminisce about the days gone by. At social gatherings, Eleanor was known for her cheerful demeanor. She laughed, exchanged stories, and played the part of the spirited matriarch among her circle of friends. But when she returned home to the quiet stillness of her house, the smile often faded, replaced by a deep sense of solitude. One particularly cold afternoon, with gray clouds rolling across the sky, a chilling draft seeped through the window panes as Eleanor stood near the window, sipping her tea and watching the world continue without her. Amid the bustle of the street below, she couldn't help but feel like a single, unnoticed leaf drifting in the wind. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ring of the phone on the table behind her. It was her old friend, Diana. "Eleanor, hi. Are you free tomorrow afternoon? We're having a little reunion at Karen's house. It's been ages since we all got together. You should come." At first, Eleanor hesitated. Her initial instinct was to decline, as she often did with such invitations. She had grown used to staying home, enveloped in her solitude. But something inside her tugged at her heart, urging her to say yes. "All right, Diana," she finally replied with a soft sigh. "I'll be there." The next morning, Eleanor carefully chose a light blue dress, its soft hue bringing out her natural grace. Standing before the mirror, she gently brushed her silver-streaked hair and reminded herself that she still carried an elegance that had matured with time. A small smile crept across her face as she straightened her posture, ready to step back into a world of laughter and friendship. The reunion was held in a cozy, quaint home filled with warm light and cheerful chatter. Old friends embraced and shared updates about their families and lives. Eleanor listened attentively, smiling at the familiar faces that had grown older but still carried the spark of youthful camaraderie. They reminisced, laughing over long-forgotten memories. As the evening progressed, Eleanor's attention was drawn to a man sitting quietly in the corner of the room. His hair was almost completely gray, but his posture was dignified. He cradled a cup of coffee, exuding an aura of calm that seemed to set him apart. At one point, he turned his gaze toward her and offered a gentle smile, a warmth that felt like a ray of sunshine cutting through the chill of winter. "Excuse me, but do I know you?" he asked, his deep voice tinged with familiarity. Eleanor squinted slightly, studying his face. Suddenly, recognition dawned. "David Reynolds. David, you were in my business management class in college, weren't you?" David chuckled, his eyes lighting up with nostalgia. "It's been, 35 years? I can't believe it's you, Eleanor. I never expected to see you here." What began as a polite exchange soon unfolded into an animated conversation. Eleanor learned that David, a retired entrepreneur, had built a successful career before stepping back after his wife passed away. He had been living alone for several years, much like Eleanor, but his words carried a sense of quiet resilience. There was a connection in their shared experiences, a mutual understanding of what it meant to live with both loss and gratitude. As the evening wound down, David approached Eleanor one last time. "I'm so glad we ran into each other," he said warmly. "It feels like we've found something we didn't know we were missing. Could we meet again sometime? Maybe catch up properly?" If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment one below to let me know that you are still here with me. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding, a soft smile gracing her lips. "I'd like that, David. It would be nice to reconnect." That night, as Eleanor returned home, the thought of David lingered in her mind like the soft glow of a street lamp on a quiet night. For the first time in years, her heart felt a gentle stirring, as if a door she had long kept closed was now slightly ajar, inviting in a breeze of possibility. His words landed gently in Eleanor's heart, like a seed planted in the quiet soil of her emotions. She didn't respond immediately, but as she stepped out of the gathering, she felt a shift within her, like a still pond disturbed by a small stone. That evening, Eleanor sat by her window, looking out at the busy street below. The familiar scene, cars passing, people walking, seemed unchanged, but inside, she felt different. For the first time in years, she wondered if life still had something new to offer her. At 62, she had convinced herself that her heart was closed, that the chapter of her romantic life had long been written. But now, it seemed like that door might be opening just a crack, inviting a breeze that no one knew where it would lead. Since that reunion, Eleanor felt a subtle change. She couldn't stop thinking about David's warm smile and the kindness in his eyes. The memory lingered in her thoughts, like a fresh breeze sweeping through her mind. Sometimes, she would catch herself laughing softly, teasing herself for being so sensitive at her age. But not everyone can control what they heartfelt. The next morning, as Eleanor tended to her garden, carefully trimming the flowers on her balcony, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Surprised, she picked it up. "Hello," she answered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hello, Eleanor. This is David Reynolds. Do you remember me? We met yesterday at the reunion, His voice was calm, deep, and familiar, like a song she hadn't heard in years. Eleanor froze, her gardening shears pausing mid-air. Hearing his voice on the other end of the line made her feel like she was reconnecting with an old friend, even though she hadn't seen him in decades. "Yes, I remember." "David, what's the matter?" she replied, a touch of hesitation in her voice. David chuckled softly, the warmth in his voice easing her nerves. "Nothing much. I was wondering if you'd like to join me for coffee. I thought it would be nice to catch up. It's been a long time since we've seen each other." Eleanor felt a flutter in her chest. It had been years since she had gone out with anyone, let alone accepted an invitation for coffee. The thought of it made her both nervous and curious. But something in David's tone made her feel at ease, so she decided to embrace the moment. "All right, I'm free," she said, a little uncertain but more open than she had been in a long time. They agreed to meet that afternoon at a cozy cafe in the city. Eleanor spent the next few hours preparing herself. She chose simple yet elegant attire, a light dress that accentuated her grace, and carefully styled her hair, now dusted with silver, into an elegant updo. Standing in front of the mirror, she reassured herself, "It's just coffee with an old friend. Nothing to be nervous about." But despite her calm words, her heart raced with anticipation. The cafe David had chosen was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, far from the hustle and bustle of daily life. The interior wasn't flashy, but it had a nostalgic charm. Old landscape paintings lined the walls, and an antique clock ticked slowly in the center of the room, stretching time with each passing second. When Eleanor entered, she immediately saw David sitting at a table near the window. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his warm, inviting eyes behind his glasses greeted her with the same quiet dignity she remembered. He rose to his feet as she approached, his smile both familiar and comforting. "You came," he said, his voice filled with pleasant surprise. Eleanor smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I promised, didn't I? How could I not come?" David gestured for her to sit, pulling out the chair for her with a gentle hand. He ordered 2 cups of chamomile tea, simple, soothing, perfect for an afternoon chat. "This is just right for an afternoon like this. Gentle, calming," he said, his voice still as warm and steady as before. Their conversation began with the usual pleasantries, catching up on life, reminiscing about old friends, and sharing stories from their youth. David spoke fondly of his career and his family, how he had built his business from the ground up, and how life had taken unexpected turns. He shared the heartbreaking loss of his wife over a decade ago, her sudden illness shaking him to his core. "It felt like my world collapsed," he confessed. "But over time, I had to learn to live alone, even though the loneliness has never really left." Eleanor listened intently, her heart stirred by his vulnerability. She realized that, much like herself, David had endured loss, and had faced the challenges of solitude with strength and resilience. She noticed the quiet pauses in his speech, moments when he seemed lost in a memory, a grief that never fully healed. As the light outside dimmed, the soft strains of an old folk song filled the air, deepening the reflective mood of their conversation. David looked at her, his gaze thoughtful, and his voice softened. "Eleanor, have you ever thought that even at this stage in our lives, we can still find someone to share our hearts with?" Eleanor was taken aback by his question. She paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "I'm not sure anymore," she replied softly, a smile playing on her lips. "I've convinced myself that my heart has closed. I've grown accustomed to living alone." David looked at her with understanding, his eyes soft but steady. "Sometimes we live alone not because we want to, but because we're afraid of opening up again. Afraid of losing someone we love," he said, his words sinking into the depths of Eleanor's heart. Their conversation drifted as the evening sky deepened into shades of purple. As they parted ways outside the cafe, David looked at her with a gentle smile. "I'm really glad we met today. "I hope we can do this again sometime," he said, his voice warm with sincerity. Eleanor smiled back, but she didn't respond verbally. Instead, she simply nodded, her heart fluttering in a way it hadn't in years. As she walked back to her car, she realized that she felt different, alive in a way that she hadn't for a long time. Since that meeting, Eleanor and David stayed in touch. Their conversations were often brief, but they had become a comforting ritual. He would call her in the late afternoon, his voice still carrying that same warmth. "How are your flowers doing, Eleanor? Any new blooms today?" His interest in the little details of her life made her feel seen and valued, something she hadn't experienced in years. Gradually, the calls turned into something Eleanor looked forward to each day, a small but meaningful connection. One afternoon, David called with an invitation. "There's a flower garden in the suburbs I've been meaning to visit. The chrysanthemums are in full bloom. Would you like to join me this weekend?" Eleanor hesitated, but hearing the sincerity in his voice, she agreed. "Yes, if you don't mind, I'll come with you." That weekend, they drove out to the garden, the countryside unfolding before them in vibrant colors. The bright yellow chrysanthemums stretched endlessly across the fields, and for a moment, Eleanor felt like she had stepped into a dream. As they walked through the rows of flowers, David shared stories of his travels, his laughter blending with the gentle wind. Eleanor couldn't help but smile. It had been so long since she'd felt this at peace, laughing and enjoying the simple pleasures of life. Eleanor's life had slowly begun to shift. The quiet, solitary days she had once known were now filled with the joy of conversations and shared moments. David was like a refreshing breeze that had entered her world, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of possibility stirring in her heart. David's proposal left Eleanor stunned as if she were living in a dream. For years, she hadn't even considered the idea of remarriage. Living alone had become her comfort, her norm. But now, standing before David, a patient, sincere man, Eleanor felt her heart soften. Over the next few days, she pondered deeply. Was this the right choice? Would her children understand and accept her decision? But then, the soothing phone calls from David calmed her restless heart, offering reassurance with every conversation. Finally, one late afternoon, Eleanor picked up the phone, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed David's number. "I agree," she said, her voice steady, yet filled with emotion. On the other end, David paused for a moment before his voice brightened. "Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you. I promised to bring you so much happiness." Their wedding was simple, warm, and intimate. Only a few close friends and family members were invited to witness their union. Eleanor wore a soft blue dress she had chosen carefully, a color that seemed to suit her perfectly. Her face shone with a mix of joy and uncertainty, as though part of her still questioned if this was the right path. David stood beside her, his gaze full of tenderness and appreciation. He looked at her as if she were the most precious gift life had given him. As the sun began to set, Eleanor felt a flutter in her chest. The warmth of the moment should have been enough, yet she still felt a bit out of place. David, noticing her discomfort, smiled softly. "I've always thought that a neat house brings peace of mind. But you don't see it that way, do you?" Eleanor nodded without saying a word, her heart sinking just a little. She wasn't used to this type of meticulous order. At her old home, she was surrounded by blooming flowers, books scattered on tables, and old chairs that creaked when she sat in them. The sterile neatness of this new house made her feel more like a guest than the woman of the house. Despite this, the first few days together were filled with sweetness. David kept his promises, taking care of Eleanor with the same warmth and attentiveness he had shown before their wedding. Every morning, he prepared a pot of tea, chrysanthemum tea, which he claimed was good for her health, and would gently call her to wake up. "Tea's ready, Eleanor. Come have some. It's good for your health," he would say. Eleanor couldn't help but smile whenever she saw David, standing in the kitchen with his tea set, the image of quiet care and thoughtfulness. At first, she thought it was just his habit, and she tried to adapt to it. But soon, small things began to accumulate. David had a set of rules, habits, and expectations that he wanted Eleanor to follow, from the arrangement of the furniture to the way she cooked, even to their daily schedules. One day, Eleanor had absent-mindedly left a handkerchief on the kitchen table. She didn't think much of it, but David noticed immediately. Frowning slightly, he said, "Eleanor, please don't leave the handkerchief on the table. It'll make everything dirty. Please remember to put things away properly." Eleanor was taken aback by the sternness in his voice but responded gently, "All right, I'll remember." At first, she thought it was just a habit, something she could easily adjust to. But soon, these little incidents started happening more frequently. One morning, Eleanor accidentally overslept until 8 a.m. David came into the room and stood at the door, his voice gentle but firm. "Eleanor, waking up late isn't good for your health. We're not getting any younger. We should maintain the habit of waking up early." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, her mind struggling to process his words. She sighed quietly and replied, "How long has it been since I had a peaceful, uninterrupted night's sleep?" In the past, when she lived alone, she could do things freely, without anyone to remind or constrain her. But now, it seemed that she had to adapt to a new set of rules, ones that made her feel more like a child than an independent woman. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. The differences between their personalities and habits grew more evident as David's family began to enter Eleanor's life more frequently. His children would visit on weekends, and at first, Eleanor welcomed them warmly. But she soon noticed their scrutinizing looks and the coldness in their interactions. During one family dinner, David's daughter casually remarked, "Mom, it's been years since you lost your husband. Living alone must have been hard. It's good that you have Uncle David with you now. But Dad, don't forget to protect your assets and manage them carefully." Her words cut through Eleanor like a dagger, sharp and unforgiving. She remained silent, trying to keep her composure, but she could feel her hands trembling slightly as she picked up her chopsticks. David glanced at his daughter, his expression briefly darkening, but he said nothing more. From that moment on, Eleanor understood that she was not fully accepted by David's family. That night, as Eleanor lay awake in bed, her thoughts became tangled. She missed her old home, the place where she had lived on her terms. She missed the freedom to make tea, cook, and tend to her flowers without anyone's judgment or concern. Now, in David's large, pristine house, she felt like a stranger in her own life, unsure of where she belonged. One afternoon, as she sat alone in the garden, her eyes fixed blankly on the horizon, David gently approached and asked, "Why are you sitting here by yourself? Is something wrong?" Eleanor shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing, I'm just missing the flower garden at my old home." David frowned, his concern apparent, but he didn't press further. He couldn't understand the deep, entrenched longing that Eleanor felt. Despite having everything she could need, she still felt the sadness of being displaced. As time passed, Eleanor began to realize that the happiness she had hoped to find in her new life was becoming increasingly elusive. Living with David wasn't as peaceful as she had imagined. It was filled with pressure, rules, and the sense that her personal space had been invaded. The differences in their personalities, along with the distance she felt from his family, were like tiny needles pricking at her heart each day. One evening, sitting alone in her room, Eleanor pulled out an old photo from a drawer. It was a picture of her small home from the past, the place where she had lived for so many years. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she wondered if she had made a mistake. Perhaps happiness in old age wasn't something that could be found in another person, but only within herself. That night, as she wept silently in the darkness, something shifted inside Eleanor. She realized that the suffocating life she had now was not the happiness she had envisioned. Remarriage had not brought her the peace and joy she expected. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, David sat at the dining table, his face frowning slightly as he noticed Eleanor's tardiness. "Why are you sleeping in again?" he asked, his voice tinged with reproach. Eleanor sighed deeply but said nothing. She felt like a guest in her own life, forced to follow someone else's rules. During breakfast, she remained quiet, holding her teacup without drinking, her eyes distant. David finally noticed the shift in her silence and asked gently, "What's wrong, Eleanor?" She shook her head. "Nothing. I just miss my old home," she replied, her voice soft and distant. David, still unable to understand, frowned and muttered, "Your old home was small and inconvenient. Here, you have everything you need, so why do you still miss it?" His words hit Eleanor like a sharp needle, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stood up, took her tea, and left for the kitchen, feeling heavy with the weight of her thoughts. She knew that David would never understand her need for the freedom and warmth of her small, old home. One day, a young woman from the neighborhood came to visit. She had bright, curious eyes and a friendly smile, though there was a hint of worry in her voice as she spoke. "Mrs. Reynolds, I heard you live alone now. I'm concerned you might be lonely in your old age." Eleanor smiled gently, her eyes softening as she spoke. "Don't worry, dear. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes when you can't find joy in your own company." Eleanor had once believed that happiness could only be found in someone else, but now she understood that true happiness lies within. It doesn't matter how old you are, what matters is loving and cherishing yourself. The young woman nodded thoughtfully. "I understand now. I want to live happily, just like you." Eleanor smiled, nodding back. "Yes, I thought I needed someone else to lean on, but now I know that happiness doesn't have to come from others. Sometimes, the greatest joy comes from within. Loving yourself and living the life you desire is all that truly matters." As they both turned to gaze out at the garden, where the chrysanthemums were blooming under the midday sun, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of peace. In the days that followed, Eleanor's life grew richer. She joined a local senior club, where she and other members practiced qigong in the mornings, took walks around the park, and shared stories and laughter. It was a new chapter, one filled with personal growth and joy. At one of the club's gatherings, Eleanor shared her story with the group. "I once thought remarriage would bring happiness in my later years, but I've learned that sometimes what we expect isn't what we need. In old age, we need freedom, independence, and the ability to control our own lives. Living alone doesn't mean being lonely. Sometimes, it's even more fulfilling than having someone by your side. Happiness doesn't come from others. It comes from within." The group applauded, and soon, the conversation shifted to everyone's different life choices. Some people choose to live close to their children, others prefer the freedom of living alone. Whatever the choice may be, the most important thing is to live happily and comfortably on our terms, they all agreed, nodding in unison. That afternoon, Eleanor sat down to write a letter to her two children. She poured her heart out, sharing her thoughts on her current life. "Dear children, I found a new kind of joy in my small home. I am not lonely. I take care of myself, enjoy tending to my flowers, and cooking meals I love, and I have good friends and hobbies that keep me fulfilled. Every day is meaningful to me. Please know that happiness in old age doesn't come from always having someone by your side, but from how you choose to live. Don't worry about me. Just live your lives fully and happily with your families." After finishing the letter, Eleanor carefully folded it and placed it in an envelope. She hoped her children would understand and feel at ease with her decision. Later that day, a young woman from the neighborhood came by to visit Eleanor. "Mrs. Reynolds, I heard you live alone now. I'm worried you might be feeling lonely," she said, her voice laced with concern. Eleanor smiled gently at the young woman and invited her to sit at the small wooden table on the porch. She poured her a cup of hot tea and replied, "Loneliness doesn't always come from living alone, dear. People can be lonely when they're not able to find joy in their own company. I once thought happiness came from others, but I learned that true happiness comes from within. No matter our age, the key is to love and cherish ourselves." The young woman nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. I understand now. I'll try to live happily like you." Eleanor smiled warmly, nodding in agreement. "Yes, I used to believe I needed someone else to lean on, but I've realized that happiness doesn't need to come from someone else. Sometimes, loving yourself and living the life you choose is the most important thing." They both turned to look at the garden, where the chrysanthemums were blooming brightly under the midday sun. Eleanor's wedding to David took place in a cozy, intimate setting, with only close family and a few friends in attendance. She wore a soft blue dress she loved, her face radiating joy but still showing signs of uncertainty. David stood beside her, his gaze filled with tenderness and affection as if she were the most precious gift life had given him. As the sun set, Eleanor felt a flutter of excitement, but there was also a hint of awkwardness. David smiled at her and said, "I've always thought a tidy home brings peace of mind. But I'm guessing that's not quite your style, is it?" Eleanor nodded but didn't respond. Inside, she felt a slight unease about her new home. She was accustomed to the cozy nooks filled with flowers, books scattered across the tables, and the creak of old wooden chairs. The clinical neatness here made her feel more like a guest than the homeowner. Despite this, the first few days of living together were sweet. David kept his promises, taking good care of Eleanor, just as he had vowed during their wedding. Every morning, he would prepare a pot of chrysanthemum tea and call her to wake up. "Tea's ready, Eleanor. You should drink it. I hear it's great for your health." Eleanor couldn't help but smile whenever she saw David in the kitchen, with his tea set in hand. Despite being in his twilight years, David was still thoughtful and attentive. "Why do you always remind me?" she would think to herself. Initially, she figured it was just his habit, so she tried to adapt. But gradually, the small details began to add up. David had his routines, and he expected Eleanor to follow them, from the way the furniture was arranged to how meals were cooked and the daily schedule. Once, Eleanor had accidentally left a handkerchief on the kitchen table and forgotten to put it away. David noticed immediately, frowned slightly, and said, "Eleanor, don't leave things like that on the table. It'll make everything look messy. Please, put it away." Eleanor was caught off guard by the stern tone, but she nodded and gently replied, "All right, I'll remember." At first, she thought it was just a minor quirk of his, something she could easily adjust to. But as time went on, these little things began to pile up. One morning, Eleanor overslept until 8 a.m. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the room in warmth. When she opened the door, David was already sitting at the dining table, holding a newspaper. His face seemed slightly displeased as he saw her. "Eleanor, why are you still in bed?" "You're wasting the day," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of concern. Eleanor sighed softly but didn't respond. Inside, she felt as though she were merely a guest in her own life, bound by someone else's rules. At breakfast, Eleanor remained silent, holding her cup of tea but not drinking it. Her gaze was distant, staring through the window. David finally noticed the quiet tension and asked, "What's wrong, Eleanor?" She shook her head slightly, "Nothing. I just miss my old home." David furrowed his brow, but his voice betrayed a hint of frustration. "Your old home was small and inconvenient. Here, you have everything you need. Why do you still miss it?" Eleanor's heart sank at his words, and she couldn't help but feel a deeper sense of isolation. David couldn't understand the depth of her attachment to her old life. The simplicity, the comfort of knowing every nook and cranny of her home. She wasn't just missing the physical space, but the freedom that came with it. As time went on, Eleanor began to realize that the happiness she had hoped to find with David was not as fulfilling as she had imagined. The rigid structure of their life together, combined with the ever-present differences in their personalities and expectations, left her feeling stifled. Even the well-intentioned care from David now felt more like a constraint than a comfort. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. That evening, as Eleanor sat alone in the living room, something deep inside her shifted. She had hoped that remarriage would bring her a sense of completion, a sense of belonging. But now, it felt like she was just going through the motions. She missed her old home, the freedom to do things on her terms, to live without constantly measuring up to someone else's expectations. As the days passed, Eleanor realized that living with David didn't bring the joy she had hoped for. And one evening, she made a decision. She quietly packed her things, telling David she needed some time alone to think about everything. He was concerned but didn't argue. He respected her decision, though he couldn't fully understand it. Eleanor left their shared home, returning to her small, quiet space where she had found peace before. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision lift from her shoulders. Sometimes, the greatest freedom comes from being able to live life on your terms, without the pressures or expectations of others. Eleanor's words cut through David's heart like a sharp needle. She didn't say another word, simply standing up and taking her tea into the kitchen, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her. She knew there were things David would never understand, like the freedom she had found in the warmth and simplicity of her old home, where she had spent so many years of her life, alone but at peace. After days of internal conflict, Eleanor decided to return to her old home. The small house still carried the familiar scent of days gone by: tea, wood, and flowers. She stepped inside, placed her suitcase down on the floor, and sank into the old wooden chair by the window. The moonlight poured into the quiet room, casting a peaceful glow across the space. Everything remained the same as it was the day she left. Dust lightly settled on the tea table, and family photos on the shelf still glowed with memories of better times. Eleanor poured herself a cup of hot jasmine tea, the comforting aroma filling the room, chasing away the chill in her heart. At that moment, she felt as if she had just woken from a long, restless dream. Her body and soul felt light, but full of emotion. Since marrying David, she had worked hard to adapt to a life she thought would bring her joy. But in reality, she had lost herself. Living in the confines of David's structured world, she had felt more like a visitor in her own home than the woman she once was. The next morning, Eleanor woke up late again. The sunlight had already filled the room, streaming through the window into the spacious space she now called home. She opened the door, and there was David, sitting at the dining table with a newspaper, a frown on his face as he looked up at her. "Eleanor, why are you still in bed?" "You're wasting the day," he said, his voice calm but laced with reproach. Eleanor sighed softly and didn't respond. Inside, she felt like a stranger in her own life, forced to follow rules and routines that weren't hers. At breakfast, she remained silent, staring out the window, her teacup untouched in her hands. David, sensing the change in the silence between them, asked gently, "What's wrong, Eleanor?" She shook her head, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Nothing, I just miss my old home," she replied quietly. David frowned, his voice tinged with frustration. "Your old home was cramped and lacking in conveniences. Here, you have everything you need. Why do you still long for it?" Her words struck Eleanor like a painful blow. She didn't answer him, instead getting up and walking toward the kitchen with her tea. She knew David would never understand the freedom she once had, the freedom to be herself, to make her own choices, to live without constant reminders of what needed to be done, without anyone judging her for the way she chose to live. "I can't do this anymore," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with sorrow. David approached her again, concern in his eyes. "Why are you saying that?" he asked urgently. Eleanor looked at him, calm yet filled with deep sadness. "I can't continue living here," she said softly. "I lost my joy the moment I stepped into this house." David sat down next to her, his voice filled with regret. "Eleanor, I truly wanted you to have a better life. I thought I was doing everything right, but I see now that I was wrong. For myself as much as for you." Eleanor sighed and looked at him with a soft, almost mournful expression. "This life isn't for me. I thought I needed someone to lean on, but what I read is freedom and peace within my own life." She stood up, gently zipping up her suitcase. David watched her, his eyes filled with helplessness. Perhaps, for the first time, he realized that love wasn't just about maintaining order and providing a comfortable life. It was about accepting each other's true selves, quirks and all. Eleanor knew this was the right decision. That night, as she sat alone in her room, the soft yellow light from the lamp illuminated the bare walls. Her suitcase lay open in front of her, with just a few sets of clothes and personal items inside. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there, but with each passing minute, her heart grew heavier. Memories from her past filled her mind, like an old movie. The small house where she had once lived in solitude, the quiet afternoons brewing tea, reading until the late hours, and tending to her garden. It had been a simple, peaceful life, filled with a freedom she hadn't truly appreciated until now. Now, she thought about her life in David's large, impersonal house, the constant reminders, the scrutinizing glances from David's children. She realized that this house, though beautiful, was not truly her home. It felt more like a gilded cage. That night, as tears quietly slipped down her face, something inside Eleanor changed. The suffocating pressure of her new life weighed heavily on her. It seemed that remarriage had not brought the happiness she had hoped for in her later years. She had been stirred by David's presence, but living with him had made her feel confined and alienated. Their wedding had been a simple affair, cozy and intimate, with only close friends and family present. Eleanor had worn a light blue dress she loved, her face glowing but still holding an air of uncertainty. David had stood beside her, his eyes filled with tenderness as if she were the most precious gift life had given him. As the sun set, Eleanor's eyes sparkled with emotion, but there was still a hint of discomfort. David had said, "I always believed a tidy home would bring peace of mind. But I can see that it's not your style, is it?" Eleanor had nodded, but in her heart, she felt uneasy. She was used to the cozy corners of her old home, the blooming flowers, the books scattered across the table, and the creaky wooden chairs. The meticulous neatness of David's home made her feel like a guest, not the owner. Despite these feelings, the first day of living together had been sweet. David had kept his promises, taking good care of Eleanor, as he had vowed. Every morning, he would prepare a pot of chrysanthemum tea and call her to wake up. "Tea's ready. Time to get up and drink it. I hear it's good for your health." Eleanor had smiled whenever she saw him with the tea set, standing in the kitchen. Despite his years, David had been so attentive and considerate. "Why do you always remind me?" she had thought, trying to adjust. But then, small things began to add up. David had his ways, and he expected her to follow them, arranging the furniture, cooking, and following a strict daily routine. One day, Eleanor had left a handkerchief on the kitchen table and forgotten to put it away. David had noticed immediately, frowned slightly, and said, "Eleanor, please don't leave things on the table. It'll make everything messy. Remember to put it in its place." Eleanor had been surprised by his stern tone, but she had nodded gently, saying, "All right, I'll remember." At first, she thought it was just a quirk of his, something she could adapt to. But over time, these small incidents had started to build up. Then, one morning, Eleanor had woken up late again. Sunlight streamed into the room, filling the space with warmth. When she opened the door, she saw David sitting at the dining table, holding a newspaper. His face showed mild frustration as he saw her. "Eleanor, why are you still in bed?" he had asked, his voice calm but filled with reproach. Eleanor sighed softly and remained silent. She felt like she was merely a guest in her own life, following someone else's schedule. At breakfast, she held her cup of tea without taking a sip, her gaze distant as she stared out the window. David had noticed the change in her silence and asked, "What's wrong, Eleanor?" She had shaken her head lightly. "Nothing. I just miss my old home." David frowned but then replied, "Your old home was cramped and inconvenient. Here, you have everything you need. Why do you still miss it?" His words had pierced Eleanor's heart like a sharp needle. She hadn't said anything more, simply getting up and taking her tea into the kitchen, her soul heavy with the realization that she could no longer live like this. Eleanor sat beside David in the living room of the small house he had lovingly prepared to welcome her. The room was simply decorated but exuded warmth, with every object bearing the subtle marks of family life. David gently took Eleanor's hand and softly said, "Eleanor, from now on, you're no longer alone. We will live happily and peacefully together." Eleanor looked at him, her heart stirring with a quiet joy. She truly believed this was the right decision. After years of solitude and silence, she had finally found someone with whom she could share her joys and sorrows. Outside the window, the gentle moonlight bathed the small courtyard, and a new chapter had begun in Eleanor's life, as serene as the first morning light. On her first day living with David, the new environment felt both exciting and unfamiliar. David's house was spacious and well-equipped, but the structure of it felt rigid and overly organized. As she walked through the living room, Eleanor couldn't help but notice that each cushion on the sofa was perfectly arranged, as though it had been carefully placed by a maid, and the decorative items shone so brightly that they almost seemed to gleam. It was spotless, a quality that had always been important to David. "How do you keep your house so tidy?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the curiosity from her voice as David showed her around. David smiled, his voice calm but with a trace of pride. "It's a habit I've had for years. A tidy home brings peace to the mind." Eleanor nodded, but in her heart, she couldn't help but feel something was off about her new home. She was used to a place that felt more lived in, a place where flowers bloomed in every corner, books were scattered across tables, and wooden chairs creaked when they were sat in. Here, everything felt too perfect and too structured, and she felt like a guest rather than the owner of the space. Despite these feelings, the first few days of living together were still sweet. David took excellent care of Eleanor, as he had promised on their wedding day. Every morning, he would prepare a pot of chrysanthemum tea and call her to wake up. "Tea's ready. Time to get up and enjoy it. I heard chrysanthemum tea is very good for your health," he would say. Eleanor smiled every time she saw him in the kitchen, standing by the tea set. He was an older man, but still thoughtful and attentive, qualities she appreciated. "Why do you always have to remind me?" she thought to herself, amused by his persistence. At first, she thought it was just a habit of his, something she could easily get used to. But then, small things began to build up. David had his own rules and routines that he expected her to follow, from the way the furniture should be arranged, to how meals were prepared, to the daily schedules. One day, Eleanor accidentally left a handkerchief on the kitchen table and forgot to put it away. David noticed immediately, frowning slightly as he said, "Eleanor, please don't leave the handkerchief on the table. It'll make everything dirty. Remember to put it in its place." Eleanor was momentarily taken aback by his stern tone but nodded gently. "All right, I'll remember." At first, she thought it was just one of David's little quirks, and she tried to adapt. But over time, these small incidents became more frequent, and Eleanor began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. One morning, Eleanor woke up late again. The sunlight was already streaming through the window, filling the room with light. When she opened the door, she saw David sitting at the dining table, reading the newspaper. His face showed mild concern as he looked up at her. "Eleanor, why are you still in bed?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was filled with reproach. Eleanor sighed softly and didn't answer. Inside, she felt the growing discomfort of being forced to follow rules and schedules that didn't fit her natural rhythm. At breakfast, she remained silent, holding her cup of tea without taking a sip, her eyes distant as she stared out the window. Finally, David noticed the change in her demeanor and asked gently, "What's wrong, Eleanor?" Eleanor shook her head lightly. "Nothing. I just miss my old home." David frowned, his voice tinged with frustration as he replied, "Your old home was cramped and lacked conveniences. Here, you have everything you need. Why do you still miss it?" His words hit Eleanor like a sharp needle. She didn't respond, merely stood up and walked toward the kitchen with her tea, her heart heavy. She knew David would never understand the simple joys of freedom and the warmth of her old home, a place where she had lived for so many years. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 4 below to let me know that you are still here with me. A few days later, a young woman from the neighborhood came to visit Eleanor. The young woman had bright, clear eyes and a radiant smile, but her voice carried a hint of concern. "Mrs. Eleanor, I heard you live alone now. I'm worried that you might be lonely in old age." Eleanor looked at the young woman and smiled gently. "Don't worry, dear. Loneliness doesn't mean living alone. People are lonely when they can't find joy in their lives." Eleanor had once tried to find happiness in the company of others, but she had learned that true happiness lies within herself. Whether young or old, the most important thing is to love and cherish oneself. The young woman nodded, her understanding clear. "I understand now. I will live happily like you." Eleanor smiled and nodded. "Yes, I once thought I needed someone to lean on, but I realized that happiness doesn't have to come from anyone else. Sometimes, loving yourself and living the life you want is the most important thing." The two women sat together and gazed out at the garden where the bright yellow chrysanthemums were blooming, basking in the midday sun. The moment felt peaceful, as if all the answers Eleanor needed were right there, in the simplicity of life around her. In the days that followed, Eleanor's life took on new meaning. She began joining clubs for elderly people in her neighborhood. Together, they practiced qigong every morning, walked around the park, and shared conversations like young women, laughing and enjoying the camaraderie. One afternoon, during a group activity, Eleanor shared her story with the others. "I used to think that remarriage in old age would bring happiness, but sometimes what we think isn't always true. I've learned that in old age, we need freedom, mental independence, and control over our own lives. Living alone doesn't mean being lonely. Sometimes it's even happier than having someone beside you. We don't need to seek happiness from others. We can find it within ourselves." The group applauded, and the discussion continued. Some people choose to live near their children, others prefer to live alone, free. No matter the choice, the most important thing is to live happily and comfortably in our way, they all agreed. That afternoon, Eleanor wrote a letter to her 2 children, sharing the changes she had made in her life. "Dear children, I have found joy in my small home. I am not lonely. I take care of myself, tend to my flowers, cook meals I enjoy, and have friends and hobbies. Every day is meaningful. I want you to understand that happiness in old age doesn't come from having someone beside you, but from how you choose to live your own life. Don't worry about me. Just live happily with your families." After folding the letter and sealing it in an envelope, Eleanor felt confident that her children would understand her decision and feel reassured about her life. Later that afternoon, the young woman from the neighborhood visited again. "Mrs. Eleanor, I heard you live alone. I'm worried you might be lonely in old age." Eleanor invited her to sit at the small wooden table on the porch, pouring her a cup of hot tea. Loneliness doesn't mean living alone, dear. People are lonely when they can't find joy in their lives. I once tried to find happiness from others, but I realized that happiness lies within myself. Whether young or old, the most important thing is to love and cherish oneself. The young woman nodded, eyes bright with understanding. Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor. I understand now. I will live happily like you. Eleanor smiled, watching the young woman's face light up with newfound clarity. Yes, I thought I needed someone to lean on, but I've realized that happiness doesn't come from anyone else. Sometimes, loving yourself and living the life you desire is the most important thing. They both looked out at the blooming chrysanthemums in the midday sun, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt truly at peace. Eleanor and David's wedding had been small and intimate, attended only by a few close friends and family members. Eleanor wore a simple yet elegant light blue dress that she adored. Despite the warmth of the moment, a hint of confusion lingered on her face. David stood beside her, his eyes filled with tenderness, as if this was the most precious gift life had ever given him. The small ceremony marked the beginning of a new chapter, but Eleanor still felt a quiet unease as the day unfolded. The evening sky softened into hues of orange and pink as they shared their vows, but inside, Eleanor felt an underlying discomfort, unsure of what to expect from this new life. As she sat beside David that night, her heart stirred with both hope and doubt. The quiet, gentle moonlight shone down onto the small courtyard, and for a moment, it seemed as though the world had paused, waiting for her to find her place in this new reality. When Eleanor first moved in with David, the environment felt both foreign and exciting. David's home was spacious, well-maintained, and meticulously organized. Yet the rigid structure of everything left Eleanor with a sense of being out of place. As she walked into the living room, she noticed the cushions on the sofa were arranged to perfection, as if by an invisible hand. The decorative pieces sparkled under the soft light, reflecting a well-kept, almost clinical neatness. "How do you always keep everything so tidy?" she asked, attempting to mask her surprise as David showed her around. David smiled warmly, his voice steady and calm, though a subtle pride seeped through his words. "It's been my habit for years. A tidy home brings peace to the mind." Eleanor smiled back, but in her heart, she felt a growing discomfort. She had always loved the warmth of her old home, with its cozy corners, scattered books, and the plants she lovingly tended. Here, everything was orderly to the point of being sterile, leaving her with a feeling of being a guest, rather than someone who belonged. Still, the first few days in David's house were filled with tenderness. As he had promised, David took great care of Eleanor, preparing a pot of chrysanthemum tea every morning and calling her to wake up. "Tea's ready, Eleanor. Come have some. I heard chrysanthemum tea is very good for your health." Every time she saw him in the kitchen, pouring the tea with the same careful precision, she smiled, appreciating his thoughtfulness. Yet, something about it felt like an unspoken reminder, a sign of how different their lives had become. "Why does he always have to remind me?" Eleanor thought to herself. She initially chalked it up to David's habits and tried to adapt to his routines. But gradually, she began to feel the weight of his expectations. From arranging the furniture to cooking meals and even scheduling their days, David had rules he wanted Eleanor to follow. It was as if he was trying to impose his way of life onto hers, and although it wasn't harsh, the constant reminders left her feeling stifled. One day, Eleanor left a handkerchief on the kitchen table, distracted by her thoughts. When David saw it, he frowned slightly and said, "Eleanor, please don't leave the handkerchief on the table. It will make everything dirty. Remember to put it in its place." Eleanor was taken aback by the sternness in his tone, but she nodded gently, saying, "All right, I'll remember." She thought it was just another of his habits, something she would soon get used to. But as the days went on, more small incidents like this began to accumulate, and Eleanor's unease grew. One morning, she woke up late. The sunlight was already streaming through the window, filling the spacious room with warmth. When she stepped into the dining room, she found David sitting at the table, reading the newspaper. His face was slightly creased with concern when he saw her. "Eleanor, why are you sleeping so late again?" His voice, though not loud, carried a reproachful tone. Eleanor sighed softly but didn't respond. Inside, she felt like she was merely going through the motions of living, following rules she never agreed to. She remained silent through breakfast, holding her teacup without taking a sip, her eyes staring absently out the window. Finally, David noticed her silence and asked gently, "What's wrong, Eleanor?" Shaking her head, she replied quietly, "Nothing. I just miss my old home." David frowned, and then, with a trace of dissatisfaction, said, "Your old home was cramped, and it lacked conveniences. Here, you have everything you need. Why do you still miss it?" His words hit Eleanor like a sharp needle. She didn't respond but simply stood up and walked to the kitchen with her tea, feeling an increasing heaviness in her chest. She knew that David could never understand the quiet joys of her former life, the comfort of her small, flower-filled home where she had lived in peace. "I can't continue living like this anymore," Eleanor said quietly, her voice filled with sorrow. David stood up, alarmed, his face etched with concern. "Why are you saying that?" he asked urgently. Eleanor looked at him with calm eyes, but deep sorrow filled her heart. "I can't continue living here. I lost my joy the moment I stepped into this house." David sat beside her, his voice full of regret. "Eleanor, I truly want you to have a better life. I thought I was doing everything right by you, but I've come to realize I was wrong, for both of us." Eleanor's voice was soft, almost like a sigh. "This life isn't for me. I thought I needed someone to lean on, but what I need is freedom and peace within my own life." She stood up and began to zip up her suitcase. David watched helplessness in his eyes. For the first time, he understood that love wasn't just about maintaining order and peace. It was about embracing each other's true selves. That night, Eleanor sat in her room, the soft yellow light casting shadows on the blank white walls. Her suitcase sat open in front of her, filled with only a few sets of clothes and some personal belongings. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there, but she could feel the weight of her heart with each passing second. Memories of her past flooded her thoughts. She thought of the small house where she had lived, content with the simplicity of life. The afternoon she spent brewing tea, reading books, and tending to her flowers. Those were the moments that had filled her life with joy. It had been a simple life, but one that had allowed her to feel free and at peace. Now, as she sat in David's spacious but cold house, she felt the emptiness of it all, the constant pressure of rules, and the judgmental looks from his children. She realized this place was not her home. It was beautiful, yes, but also empty, a cage that had been decorated to look like a sanctuary. That night, tears fell silently as she reflected on the truth that had slowly unfolded in her heart. The life she had hoped for in her later years, one filled with companionship and warmth, wasn't as she imagined. Her heart had been touched by David's presence, but living with him felt suffocating and alienating. It seemed that remarriage had not brought her the happiness she had hoped for. The freedom she once had, the simple pleasures she cherished, had been lost. Eleanor's decision had been made. This new life, this new chapter, was not meant for her. She longed for the peace that could only be found in the simplicity of her own choices, in the freedom to live as she wished. She knew now that her happiness didn't come from someone else, it came from within herself. And with that understanding, she knew what she had to do. Mrs. Lon smiled whenever she saw Mr. Min with his tea set, standing in the kitchen. He was a man in his twilight years, but still so considerate and attentive. "Why do you always have to remind me?" she thought to herself. Initially, she thought it was just Mr. Min's habit, so she tried to adapt. But then, small things began to accumulate. Mr. Min always had his own rules and expected Mrs. Lon to follow them, from arranging the furniture and cooking to daily schedules. Once, Mrs. Lon accidentally left a handkerchief on the kitchen table and forgot to put it away. Mr. Min noticed, frowned slightly, and said, "Mrs. Lon, please don't leave the handkerchief on the table. It will dirty everything. Remember to put it in its place." Mrs. Lon was slightly taken aback by Mr. Min's stern demeanor but gently replied, "All right, I'll remember." Initially, she thought it was just Mr. Min's habit, so she tried to adapt. But then, small incidents like this became more frequent. Mr. Min stood there, worried, seeing Mrs. Lon. "Where are you going?" he asked with concern in his voice. Mrs. Lon looked up at him, her eyes calm but deeply sorrowful. "Where are you going?" Mr. Min asked again, his voice full of worry. Mrs. Lon responded with a serene yet sorrowful tone, "I think it's time for me to decide." That night, as tears silently fell on her face, something inside Mrs. Lon had changed. The suffocation of her new life began to weigh heavily on her. It seemed that remarriage did not bring the happiness she had hoped for in her old age. Her heart had been stirred by Mr. Min's presence, but living with him felt restrictive and alienating. Mrs. Lon sat beside Mr. Min in the living room of the small house he had prepared to welcome her. The living room was simply but warmly decorated, each object bearing the mark of a family. Mr. Min gently held Mrs. Lan's hand and softly said, "Mrs. Lon, from today on, you are no longer alone. We will live happily and peacefully together." Mrs. Lon looked at him, her heart gently stirred. She believed that this was the right decision. After so many years of living in solitude and silence, she had finally found someone to share her joys and sorrows with. Every day outside the window, the gentle moonlight shone down onto the small courtyard. A new beginning had started in Mrs. Lan's life, as gentle as that first day. On the first day, she moved in with Mr. Min. The new environment was both exciting and unfamiliar. Mr. Min's house was spacious and well-equipped, but the arrangement of everything was somewhat rigid and overly structured. As she walked into the living room, Mrs. Lon noticed that each cushion on the sofa was neatly arranged as if by a maid's hand. The decorative items were so shiny they could be used as mirrors, and Mr. Min's house was always so clean. "How do you always keep your house so tidy?" she asked when Mr. Min took her on a tour of the house. Mr. Min smiled, his voice still deep and calm but with a hint of pride. "It's been my habit since before. A tidy house brings peace to the mind." Mrs. Lon looked at him but didn't say anything more. In her heart, she felt something different about her new home. She was used to the small, flower-filled corners, the messy piles of books on the table, and the old wooden chairs that creaked when sat upon. The absolute neatness here suddenly made her feel like a guest rather than the owner of the house. Despite the initial discomfort, the first few days of living together were still sweet. Mr. Min took good care of Mrs. Lon, as he had promised on their wedding day. Every morning, he would prepare a pot of chrysanthemum tea and call her to wake up. "Tea is ready. Wake up and have some. I heard chrysanthemum tea is very good for your health." Mrs. Lon smiled whenever she saw Mr. Min with his tea set, standing in the kitchen. He was a man in his twilight years, but still so considerate and attentive. "Why do you always have to remind me?" she thought to herself. Initially, she thought it was just Mr. Min's habit, so she tried to adapt. But then, small things began to accumulate. Mr. Min always had his own rules and expected Mrs. Lon to follow them, from arranging the furniture and cooking to daily schedules. She found herself starting to feel suffocated by the structure of his life. Despite his good intentions, she realized she longed for the freedom she had once enjoyed in her own home. The small acts of kindness, like the tea and his reminders, no longer brought her comfort. Instead, they began to feel like constraints she had not anticipated in this new chapter of her life. The young woman nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. "Thank you, Mrs. Lon. I understand now. I will live happily like you." Mrs. Lon smiled warmly, her heart lightened by the exchange. "Yes," she said softly, "I thought I needed someone to lean on, but I realized that happiness doesn't have to come from someone else. Sometimes, loving oneself and living the life you desire is the most important thing." The young woman smiled back, and they both turned their attention to the garden, where the bright yellow chrysanthemums bloomed in full glory, the sunlight bathing them in a golden hue. It was a peaceful moment, a reminder of the simple joys in life that could be found if only one took the time to appreciate them. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 5 below to let me know that you are still here with me. As the days passed, Mrs. Land's life continued to unfold in ways she had never anticipated. She had discovered a deep sense of fulfillment in her solitude, a serenity she hadn't known in years. She began to embrace her independence, joining a local club for elderly people in her neighborhood, where she made new friends and engaged in activities that nourished her body and soul. Every morning, she practiced qigong with her peers, taking long walks around the park, chatting with others who shared her passion for life, and laughing freely. One afternoon, during a group activity, Mrs. Land shared her journey with the group. "I used to think that remarriage in old age would bring happiness, but sometimes what we think isn't always right. I've learned that in old age, we need freedom and mental independence, as well as control over our own lives. Living alone doesn't mean being lonely. Sometimes it's even happier than having someone beside you. We don't need to seek happiness from others. We can find it within ourselves." The group nodded in agreement, and the room filled with applause. They began to discuss more about their perspectives on life and aging. Some people choose to live near their children. Some prefer to live alone and freely. Regardless of the choice, the most important thing is to live happily and comfortably in our way, they all agreed, a sense of shared wisdom permeating the conversation. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Land sat down at her desk and began writing a letter to her children. Her hands moved slowly as if each word was an offering of love and reassurance. "Dear children, I have found joy in my small home. I am not lonely. I take care of myself, tend to my flowers, cook meals I enjoy, and have my friends and hobbies. Every day of my life is meaningful. I want you to understand that happiness in old age doesn't necessarily come from having someone beside you, but from how you choose to live your own life. Don't worry about me. Just live happily with your own families." After finishing the letter, Mrs. Land carefully folded it and placed it in an envelope, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She believed that her children would understand her choice and feel reassured by the life she had built for herself. A few days later, the young woman from the neighborhood visited Mrs. Land again. "Mrs. Land, I heard you live alone. I'm worried you might be lonely in old age." Mrs. Land looked at the young woman and smiled gently, inviting her to sit at the small wooden table on the porch. She poured her a cup of hot tea, letting the warmth fill the air between them. "Loneliness doesn't mean living alone, dear. People are lonely when they can't find joy in their lives. I once tried to find happiness from others, but then I realized that happiness lies within myself. Whether young or old, the important thing is to love and cherish oneself." The young woman nodded thoughtfully, her face reflecting a new understanding. "Thank you, Mrs. Land. I will live happily like you." Mrs. Land smiled, feeling content in the knowledge that her journey had made an impact. Together, they sat in silence for a moment, watching the chrysanthemums continue to bloom under the midday sun. As we reflect on Mrs. Land's journey, we see how embracing independence, self-love, and the simple joys of life can lead to fulfillment, especially as we age. Her story reminds us that happiness doesn't necessarily come from others, but from within ourselves. The lessons she's learned along the way are a powerful reminder to find peace in our own lives, regardless of our circumstances. So, what have you learned from Mrs. Land's story? What is one thing that you will practice in your own life moving forward? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what resonated with you the most. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring content like this. Thank you for watching, and remember, happiness begins within.